My name is Matt Brailsford. You can find me on Twitter via @MattBrailsford. But I also run a small digital agency in the UK called Outfield Digital, where we predominantly do web builds using Umbraco, working generally with other agencies. So if you do need some Umbraco help, then by all means get in touch. But today I'm here to tell you about how I fell in love with VueJS, which is kind of grand. But I think the artist Turner said it best with what's love got to do with it. So there's a big thing about people getting passionate about code, and it's like, why? Because it's just code, right? I mean, and it is, but I've been coding now for years, and a lot longer than I've been kind of doing it as a career. So it's not just a career, it's something that I'm passionate about and that I love to do, and it's my way of being creative. So for me, it all started in 1987 when I was just 7 years old. Back then, Michael Jackson was being bad, man in the mirror. Johnny was showing Baby the time of her life. And Donald Trump famously promised he would never want to be president. So what a difference 30 years makes. But for me, it's probably the year that important year for me, because it was the year that I received what was probably the most significant Christmas gift that I would ever receive. No, yeah, I had a beard at 7 years old as well. And that was one of these. So this is a Sinclair ZX Spectrum 128K plus 2A. So they didn't have Semver back then, clearly, for the version numbers. But back then I didn't really know what it was, what it did. To me, it was just like quite magical. I plugged it into my TV, I'd get this, and this to me was just like a portal into another world. I could play games, and if anybody's got a Spectrum, you'll know what this sounds like. If you haven't, then look it up on YouTube, because if you wanted to play games then, you had to go through 3 minutes of this, and you really had to love playing games to go through that. But as well as that, it also introduced me to this. So this was like my first experience with coding. And I remember a time, me and my cousin, we spent a morning, we used to get magazines for Sinclair Spectrum, and it just had pages of code in it. So me and my cousin spent one morning on a Saturday coding in the game Pong. We'd just take it in turns, and all we were doing, we didn't know what we were doing, we were just copying lines out. I like to think we invented pair programming, but we never got the recognition. But yeah, we spent all morning coding this thing in, hit run, and we'd just created our first game. This thing didn't exist like a few hours ago. Us being 7 years old, we obviously forgot to save it, so we spent the entire Saturday and Sunday playing the most amount of Pong you've ever played in your life before we had to turn the computer off. But that was my first experience with code. Throughout the years, I'd kind of been involved in coding different ways, kind of growing up, but it wasn't until university that I started to, I guess, play the field and kind of take it seriously and start to form like different relationships with different kind of frameworks. Some sticked, some didn't, but I went through quite a few different relationships. So my first one was probably Adobe Flash. At the time, this was like fantastic. I was building rich internet applications before there were rich internet applications available. But I call this my psycho relationship because it ultimately ended with me fearing for my security with all the loopholes in the plugin. I've also had the fling, so I slept around with Knockout.js for a while. I really enjoyed that framework. That was quite a nice, enjoyable framework, but I think it kind of fell in between other different frameworks, so it never really kind of panned out. I've also had the Clinger Honor, so jQuery. I think we all probably use that a little bit longer than we probably should. We can do most of those things without it these days, but it still managed to hang around. And then probably my most recent one is the change-up. So obviously when V7 came along and with AngularJS, it's probably quite a familiar story these days. But in terms of, it came along, and as a developer, I was like, fantastic. There's this brand new framework that's getting a lot of hype, and I can learn to extend Umbraco, and then use that in kind of other areas as well. But obviously when V2 came along, that was quite a significant change. Now, I know things are a hell of a lot better now, and There's no kind of bashing of Angular here. It was just at that time when my choices were being made, this is the lay of the land where things were. So ultimately, at that point, it was just a case of, this isn't the framework that I kind of fell in love with Angular 1. But then there's the relationships that you weren't expecting as well. And that, for me, is what kind of VueJS is. I wasn't really looking for a framework. I just happened to be on Twitter one day, and I kind of noticed a tweet that somebody posted. And it sounded kind of intriguing from the tweet. And I think I'd probably seen it a few times on Twitter, but never kind of really looked into it. And so I thought, OK, let's try this out. So this is when my kind of relationship with VueJS began. Like every worthwhile relationship, it starts with a background check. So you obviously want to make sure that what you're diving into is going to do what you need it to do, and it's going to have a little bit of longevity, hopefully. What follows is kind of some of the things that are important to me. That is by no means the kind of be-all and end-all, but these are the things when I was looking at it that were my kind of decision points, which were quite good. So one of the big things of VueJS is that it's progressive, and it's sold as like the progressive framework. And that's progressive in a number of different ways. So I think from their perspective, it's progressive in that you can use it in existing projects or kind of greenfield projects. But I also like the fact that it's progressive from a learning perspective as well. So it's a lot easier to learn. Well, I found it a lot easier to learn VueJS because it starts as simple as kind of including a script file, which is one of those brilliant things that I love from Angular 1. With Angular 1, you could do the same thing, just include it and start coding. And it's progressive as well in terms of functionality. So VueJS is just the view engine, but there's supplementary kind of libraries that bolt on top as well. So you can go from quite a simple, just a view engine implementation, all the way up to kind of like rich enterprisey applications, which I think VueJS kind of gets a bit of slack for. People kind of assume and think that it's quite a simplistic framework, but really it's not. It can kind of play up there with the big boys. Obviously, if you are working with the fact that you can just include it, an important element of that is size. And again, VueJS, just the Vue library, if you're just using the Vue library, can get down as small as 23K, like minified and gzipped. So that's barely anything in comparison to a lot of other frameworks. So that was really important. And the other is obviously performance as well. So again, VueJS is on a par, if not better in areas. Like I'm not going to do a like-for-like comparison, but the reality is it's up there with kind of the big boys, I guess, in terms of performance. So again, don't be fooled into thinking it's just this simple framework that can be like a jQuery replacement. It can actually like play in the big leagues as well. For me, there was a level of familiarity. So VueJS was actually kind of a latecomer to the game, and they don't actually make any qualms about this. By doing that, they could cherry pick from other frameworks. And one of those is like the Angular kind of directives. And from the React world, they took the shadow DOM and things like that for like performant reactive rendering. But for me, this was great because this had a level of familiarity. So when I was moving over, it was like, oh, that's similar to that. And it kind of felt like I already had a leg up and not having to kind of start from scratch ultimately. It's reactive. So again, I think this is a common thing in most frameworks these days. But ultimately, that just means you don't have to manually manage the DOM yourself. It's about your data being what you manage, and that reactively kind of updates your user interface. And VueJS does that as well. And a big one, really, for me, was how friendly it is as well. So it was really easy. I felt it was really easy to kind of get started. The documentation was really good. I think anything that I've learned is from their documentation, so it's really kind of well laid out. And again, I think the documentation is kind of progressive as well in terms of they know where you're going to start, and that the starting points are simple, but the examples grow as well. You're not kind of dropped in at the deep end to try and pull it apart into the different elements. You can learn as your kind of skill set develops, which I found was really good. And so those were kind of the key things that I felt, okay, they're really cool. They're the points that I would really like to, that would really influence my decision. But you also kind of want to know who's using it as well, because it might claim all these things, but unless anybody's actually using it, is it actually living up to the hype? So there are a few kind of big players in there. So if you're from the PHP world, Laravel's quite a big one. Alibaba, which is kind of like the Amazon of the East, they're really big, and they're actually one of the driving forces behind the native approaches being taken by VueJS. GitLab, which is like an open source GitHub. PageKit, which is a CMS, their UI is Vue.js driven, and Tour de Yorkshire is a big cycling event in the UK, which I'm kind of cheating with that because that's my client. But that's the playground in where I got to kind of test Vue.js and really kind of see if it was doing the job. So this was my background research, and with this I was kind of happy with what it was offering, and that I felt it was going to be robust. So then it was time to take it on our first date, and with that I wanted to learn about the fundamentals. So how do I use this framework? What are the core features? So as I said, the simple way to get started is include the JavaScript file just as a regular script file, and then we move on to how we define our kind of template and instantiate our Vue instance. So we start with a template, and this is using regular DOM elements that we're, hopefully as like HTML developers have got a degree of familiarity. So we start here with our containing template. Inside that, we're just going to use some mustache tags and output some kind of message. And then we link that up to our Vue instance. And to create a Vue instance, we instantiate Vue and pass it a configuration object. So everything hangs off of this configuration object. In its minimum, we can do something like this, which is we tell it which element we want to bind our application to. So we reference the ID of the tag. And then we define a data model. So this is an object in a data property. And anything we define in there is going to be a property that we can kind of reference within our template language. So for example, message and message line up here. And as you might expect, this would ultimately end up kind of outputting something along these lines, a div with the hello world message in there. And because it is reactive, any attempt or anything that changes that property from a function or whatever in JavaScript, then our UI would automatically kind of update along those lines as well. So that's kind of the fundamental of how to set up the Vue instance, but then it's kind of, okay, so what are the kind of core things you're going to be using day to day in your template language? So I guess one of the main ones will be things like conditional rendering, and for this we can use a v-if directive. So again, if you're coming from the Angular world, that's like an ng-if, very similar syntax. It was just drop a letter and change one letter. So it was pretty easy to get in to switch over, and it's simply a directive is used similar to an attribute on a HTML DOM element, but it's just an instruction to Vue to do something. So in this example, whatever's between the quotes gets resolved as a Boolean expression, and if it's true, then that element will be rendered. If it's not, then it won't be at all. And we can chain those together with v-else ifs and v-else, and ultimately you can just do some decision making of what you want to show and hide. We've also got a v-show. Again, that's similar in Angular. Very similar behavior, but the v-ifs will physically render a DOM element or not. The v-shows will CSS show it or hide it. It kind of comes down to performance, which you'll choose. Generally, it'll be the VFs that you'll use most of the time. Looping's the key thing, so you want to be able to loop through some items in a collection. So for this, we've got a v-for, and it's kind of reminiscent of a familiar for loop. Whatever the v-for directive is attached to, that thing will be duplicated for however many items are in the list. And then within that object or that DOM element, we can then reference the object and access properties off of that, and then kind of do further templating. And again, with it being reactive, any additions to the array or anything removed from the array will update our HTML output as well. So we've seen outputting kind of text inside DOM elements, but occasionally as well we want to be able to bind to specific attributes on a DOM element. So for this we can use the v-bind. That's followed by a colon, and then, is it colon? I can never remember the difference between colon and semicolon. The two dots, followed by the attribute that you want to kind of bind a value to, and then whatever's in the quotes is a reference to a variable in your data model inside your view configuration. So this HTTP link will ultimately be bound to the href. There is a shorthand, so there's a couple of shorthand methods as well for common things that you're doing in VueJS. So the v-bind is one of those, because you'll probably do a lot of those. So you can actually shorten that right down to this colon followed by the attribute, and it's just a more streamlined way of doing it. Ultimately, it works exactly the same way. As well as binding to attributes, you can bind to events that get triggered by DOM elements as well. So for this, we'll use the v-on, and again, followed by the colon, and then the name of the event you want to bind to. And then this points to a function. So for any function that you want to be able to bind to in our view configuration, we have a methods object, and inside there you kind of define all the methods that you want to be exposed to your view instance. If you define them outside of that, then they're not available to your template. So this is like your public API to your template. And again, that's got a shorthand as well, because this is a common thing. So you can omit the v-on colon and just use an @ symbol followed by the event name. If you are doing .NET-based development, a kind of gotcha that I've come across is that the @ symbol is reserved, so you'd have to double those up. But I've also had a problem as well where Visual Studio likes to do its own formatting thing, and at one point those all disappeared. And that caused a problem trying to figure out what's going on. So if you are doing this inside Visual Studio and CS/HTML files, you might want to go for the more verbose option. But ultimately, again, they work exactly this. They're doing exactly the same thing. It's just a shorthand. Watchers. Again, if you're from Angular, these might be familiar, that you can watch a particular variable in your data model. This again sits in a watch object, and whatever the variable on the left is called, VueJS will watch that property in your data model higher up, and whenever that value changes, it will call this function, and you can do something else. So maybe you want to format it or do something different to it and output it as something else. To be fair, in VueJS, this is probably not the best implementation. So in VueJS, you'd probably want to use something called computed properties, which is a lot nicer solution in that you can have a computed object. Inside there, you can define some variables, and those variables, some functions, sorry, but those functions act in a similar way to these data properties. You can render them out just as properties, but they are computed. And these are really good because they ultimately build up a dependency graph of whatever you reference. So if you reference another variable from your data model, in this example, age, if the age changes, the computed variable knows that it references that property, and it updates its own value. So that's one of the benefits over watchers, but the other is that these are cached as well, whereas watchers kind of tend to run a lot more well, they just seem to run behind the scenes a lot more than computed properties do. So that's probably a better implementation. Watchers are still useful, though, in terms of like if you need to do asynchronous operations, if a variable changes, so maybe something like an autocomplete where you need to go make an async request, then a watch might be good there. But generally, if you're doing kind of these sorts of friendly formatting of variables, then computed properties might be a better option. And then lastly, there's the thing of being able to work with form fields. So you're probably going to want people to input data into your application at some point. So again, similar to the Angular NG model, we've got a V model, and it does the same thing. It's effectively a two-way bind to the input. So any change to the input field will update our data variable. So again, in the quotes, it's referencing the property in the data model that it's bound to. And likewise, any change to the property in our data model updates the input field. We have got a modifier on the end of there, so that dot number, these are kind of extensions on the end of the bind, which says enforce that this thing stays a number. So ordinarily something coming from an input would be a string, but you can put these modifiers on to enforce kind of specific rules. There's a couple out of the box, and you can define your own as well. but ultimately the V model is the two-way data binding between inputs and your model. So those are kind of the fundamental building blocks of the templates that you're probably going to use. It's also useful to kind of see the life cycle of a Vue instance. This is true of components, which we'll get onto in a little bit as well, but it's just useful to know kind of how a Vue instance is created, destroyed, and then what you can hook into in that life cycle. So along the bottom is all the different states of the VueJS instance, and along the top of the different events you can bind onto. So we can be notified when an instance or a component is being created, when it's being mounted to the DOM, when changes occur inside, when it is in the DOM, and then also when it's being destroyed, we can listen for those and do some kind of cleanup. And again, these just get added onto our configuration with specific names. So a mounted function in our config automatically hooks it up to the mounted event, and likewise the destroyed. And then finally in this first bit is the dev tools. Again, these were really useful and just really nice to use. So VueJS tends to put out nice errors, but it's also got a really nice dev tool integration. Probably this gets a bit more useful when you start to use components later on, but you get to see how your application is made up, like the component model in your app. And more importantly, you can dive into those and see the data model behind it, and also manipulate that data model and see how your front end reacts. So you can kind of tweak things and make sure things are working, and see the data changing and make sure it's doing what you're expecting it to do. And so that was the end of my first date with VueJS. So I was pretty pleased at this point. There was a lot of familiarity. I felt I could move over to it really quite easily, and it was doing all the kind of fundamental things that I needed to do. So then it was time to take it for the second date and just get to know it a bit more in a bit more detail. And that for me was components, because this is something I hadn't, well, I'd done it a little bit in Angular, but it's not exactly the same. But components was quite a new thing for me. From the end, so following on from the first things that I were looking at, I probably ended up with something a bit like this, which was one massive view and kind of one Vue instance that was just handling everything. So what you end up finding is you build repetitive elements, and you end up just copying properties in your model and having duplicates named 1, 2, and 3 and all those things. But what would be more ideal is if we could kind of encapsulate the thing that's being reused and get it to manage its own state. And this is what components allows us to do. So to define a component, we use the view.component, and this is declaring it globally. We give it a name, so this is what we're going to call our component and how we reference it in the DOM. And again, it follows the same thing of this. What follows next is the config, and this is the same kind of config that we've seen when we're creating the main Vue instance. So we can do pretty much the same thing in terms of computed properties and the events, the lifecycle events that we can hook into. So there's just a couple of extra elements specific to components, but again, we can reuse those things that we've just learned already as well. So for this example, we can define a template, and in there we're going to drop in the markup for that template, which was the button that just manages its own click state. And then we have the data model as well. And this is a slight difference as well in components, that for a component, you have to return a function that returns an object. If you didn't do that, then you'd define an object, and ultimately all components would share that same object data model, which we don't want. This is effectively an object blueprint, so you want to make sure that when somebody instantiates that, they get a fresh data model, and the way you do that is with a function returning an object. But otherwise, everything in that object is, again, exactly the same as what we've just seen in the Vue instance for the different properties. And then that just allows our kind of messy, massive page to get broken up into these reusable components. And it's ultimately like building your own little DOM elements that are kind of self-contained and can manage their own state and be a bit more kind of self-aware, I guess. And it just tidies up your main view and makes things a lot more compartmentalized. the next thing that I kind of learned about was something called X templates. It's probably not the best approach that they recommend, but I find it quite useful in terms of, I was doing a lot in terms of building it into existing applications that were just web applications. So at this point, I wasn't doing compilation or anything. I was just including the script file and just writing plain JavaScript files. But I found X templates quite useful. So in the last example, we did an inline template, which was a string. And obviously, doing HTML inside a string is not very pleasant at all. Not too bad when it's a one-liner like that, but if you're building quite big components, then it can get quite messy. And so what you can do with X templates is define a script block in your HTML file, give it a type of text/X template, give it an ID, and then you can drop in some markup inside the script tag. So most IDEs will handle that and give you all of the IntelliSense, but the true kind of DOM elements, so you get access to your regular kind of IDE, autocompletes and all that. So it's a lot nicer to work with DOM and HTML that you're used to working than trying to do all the escaping inside string variables. But ultimately, again, that works the same. All we have to do then is change our component definition to reference the ID of the template that we've just defined. So rather than the template, we just do the hash and the ID of the template that we've just defined in the next template. As I say, some people aren't as keen on that approach, but for me, it works really well. So I quite liked it at the time as I was learning. So right now we've got components that kind of just manage their own state, but we're not talking to them and they're not talking to us in any way. So at some point we're going to want to be able to pass data between the components. And again, this is something copied a bit from React World, which is the one-way data flow, which is to pass data to a component, you use properties, and to get data out, you use events. And as an example, let's say we're building a component for like a star rating. We just want to put out a few stars that show a star rating, but we want to reuse that. So we'll define a component, star rating, and to acknowledge which properties you're going to expect to be passed in, we use a props collection on our config. So in its simplest form, this can just be an array with these are the names of the attributes we're going to expect. You can go a bit further and say the types you're expecting and default values and things. But for the simplest example, you can just do an array of saying, I'm expecting an attribute called rating. And this will be passed into our component. Our template might look something like this. So again, I'm just using an X template. I'll define a div inside there. I'm just going to do some A tags for each of the stars that we're going to draw. And here I'm doing a class binding. So I'm using the shorthand for the attribute bind of a class. And we're saying apply a highlight class if this expression is true. So here it's referencing the rating property that's going to get passed into the component. And it's saying if it's 1 or more, highlight that 1 star. If it's 2 or more, highlight the 2 star, and so on and so on. So what this might look like in your kind of main template then, so if that's the component, this is the main template that it's sat in. Maybe you're looping through some products, for example. So you've got a product list. For each one of those, you'll use your star rating component. So you reference that like you would like just a DOM element. And then we pass in the rating variable. Because we want to pass in the value from the parent model, we have to bind it. So again, we're using the colons to bind. If we didn't, then the literal string product rating will get passed in. So you need to bind to pass the actual value through of that property. So that would ultimately kind of render out something like that then. So we just get some stars, a product rating value gets passed to the property. That property is then used to kind of render and change our template to what we need to be. So that would be kind of passing data in, but the next step is getting data out. So for example, say we want to be able to click on one of those stars and have that kind of be broadcast back to the parent component. We could update our template. So say for every star in that component, we'll put a click handler so we can detect which star got clicked. And we'll say we're going to call a set rating function and pass the rating value from whichever star was clicked through. We can extend our function, our component then. And again, it has the same configurations that we could have done in the instance. So we can have a methods collection. These are our public methods that are available to our component. In there, we've got a set rating. And in this, we'll pass in a new rating value. And in the simplest form, we might just say, well, just update our internal rating. but that's not telling the parent anything yet. To do that, we need to emit an event that will get passed to the parent. As I say, props go in, events come out. So to emit an event, we've got a $emit in the component instance. We can define any event name that we want to broadcast. It's up to us what we call our events. And we can pass a value that will get passed back out as well. For the parent then to listen to that, so it's okay to broadcast an event, but the parent has to listen for that event to happen as well. So we can do an event binding. So similar how you might do an event binding on a click, you can do the exact same thing on custom events being broadcast from your child components as well. So we use the VON or the @rating changed event, because that's the event we're broadcasting. And then we say, use this function to handle that event. So that's being able to pass event data back out, and that'll probably be okay in certain situations in terms of click handlers. But in this example, it's probably quite useful to be able to do two-way data binding, because the likelihood is you're going to want to say, well, update the product rating. If it's rendering the product rating, when you click it, then update the product rating, which we could do inside this function, but we can do it a lot simpler, and we can do that by implementing vModel for ourselves. So we can do vModel on our own components. So when we do vModel, this is saying we want to do a two-way data bind. And then to implement this, we update our component. And what we do is we add a model declaration into our config. And on the model declaration, you need to tell it two things. Which is the property that the two-way data bind binds to on our component, and what is the event that it broadcasts when it's telling the parent component that a change has been made. We can make one change as well, that we don't need to maintain the internal state of this component, because if you think of two-way data binding, what will actually happen is the rating will come in, someone will click, it will raise an event to tell the parent will update itself and then rebind back down. So we don't need to maintain that state internally. But this just shows that the vModel isn't anything kind of special. It uses standard approaches, and you can use those same approaches in your components. So that's probably as kind of complex as components kind of get. But it's all logical in terms of properties in, events out, and then implement vModel if you want to do two-way data binding. So that was kind of my end of the second day with VueJS. So I was quite liking this, and I found this process really quite therapeutical. As I say, when I came into this step, it was kind of one massive view and one template, but it was just really quite nice to think, oh, that would work as a component, and I could just break that out, stick the markup into a template, and define a component, and it was just like really logical in terms of learning those next steps and moving on from just the basics of like doing template-based stuff. So I obviously needed to go on a third date, and this is where things started to kind of get a little bit more serious. I'll skim over this because it can get quite complex, but hopefully it'll just inspire you a little bit. So one of the really cool things in VueJS is something called single file components. And being a good front-end developer, I needed to learn about the build process as well. I think one of the brilliant things about VueJS, though, was that I could learn it at this point. I've learned a lot of stuff about VueJS, and I was comfortable with it, and I could move on to this next step and learn about build process now when I'm comfortable. I didn't have to learn about build processes before I'd even started. So it was just a lot nicer to be able to kind of come at this at a time when I was quite comfortable with it. So in web development, we're probably quite familiar with separating your HTML, your CSS, and your script files into separate files. And this works quite well in terms of web development, but when we're talking about components, you want to be able to easily take a component from one application, say if you're developing quite reusable components, and be able to move it from project to project. If you've got things separated over different files, then that gets quite a little bit tricky. But with Vue, you can actually do something called a single file component, which lets you put all of those elements together. It is quite unique to Vue, I think. I haven't seen it in any other framework at the moment. But in order to implement this, we create a file with a .vue extension, VUE extension, and inside that we can define a template tag, which holds our HTML markup for the template, a script tag, which holds effectively an object, which is the config object from before. Because this is going to go through a build process at some point, to use single file components, you have to go through a build process. Then we can start to make use of kind of more modern scripting techniques, such as ES6 kind of syntax, which, again, it's that nice process of, I'm at this point now where I can start to learn about those things and it doesn't affect how I'm kind of thinking about what I've already learned. I can do it at a time when I'm comfortable. So, again, this is just a neater way of writing the same things that were done previously. But then the style attribute is quite a nice one as well. Because this is going to go through a processing, a compilation step, we can actually use things like CSS or Sass, and we can use variables in our component declaration, style declarations, which is quite nice. And there's also this scoped attribute. And the scoped attribute ultimately enforces that these styles apply to this component and this component only. So if you happen to have a class somewhere else in your application with the same name, then it wouldn't get affected because you've got this scoped attribute defined. It just ensures that these styles are specifically for this component and only this component, which I thought was really quite a nice way of just being able to segregate everything. So there is a slight difference. So in terms of what we've done previously with the view.component, that's ultimately defining like a global component. So that means that any component in our application will know about all the other components. But when you do things this way with view files, you're ultimately just storing a blueprint in a file. View doesn't yet know about that component, so you have to tell it about that. And the way you do that is using the ES6 syntax of doing an import of your component object, and then you tell your view instance what other components to expect within its template. The best practice usually is that you do that per kind of component and per application. You could make those all global again, but as I said, the best practice seems to be that within your view instance and within your component, you tell it what components to expect within it. So you can just include what you're using and not include if you're not using them. But beyond kind of that step of including the components, everything else, bar like ES6 nicer syntax, everything else again is ultimately the same. But then you need to then pass that through a build process. So again, this can be quite a convoluted step, and I could probably be here all day kind of explaining how to do a build process. But Vue do have quite a nice CLI to kind of guide you through that. So you would do this at the beginning of a project in terms of if you're starting a greenfield project. You can use the CLI to help you generate a script file for you. So install the CLI using npm, then you ask Vue to create a new project, and again, being progressive, it actually runs a bit of a wizard, which again I found really nice, because you can say, yeah, I want to use TypeScript, I want to use ESLint, I want to be able to use testing frameworks, but you choose to do them. You don't have to do them. Like a lot of templates kind of make an assumption that you know what you're talking about straight away, but I didn't. So again, it was really nice that I could just say, I'm not going to use all those. I just want a simple build step for now, learn about the build process, and then later on I can come back and go, do you know what, today I want to learn about TypeScript because I'm comfortable with everything else. So again, it was just a really nice progressive way of learning all the different aspects. But again, once you get past that, again, this is probably quite similar to other frameworks. You can jump into the project folder, run a dev server while you're developing locally, do things like hot reloading where it detects file changes and those types of things. And then when you're ready to deploy, then you run the build script and it generates and spits out your HTML and markup for the final build. As I say, that was a bit of a skim through on that bit, but it can get quite complex. But to me, that was just, the main thing was I could learn it at a time that I was comfortable, and I only had to learn the bits that I wanted to learn about at that point in time. So build processes are build processes at the end of the day. And yeah, so at that time I was quite comfortable. And it was at this point that I was just like, this is a really good framework. I was sold on this. So far I've just been able to kind of not breeze through it, but it was all logical in terms of how I was learning it. I'm not saying I kind of know everything, and that does lead to the fact that there is a bit of a future, and there's still plenty for me to kind of learn about it. So there's a lot more that I can do about it. These are just the fundamentals that was kind of sold it to me. Beyond that, there's a hell of a lot more. You can do routing, state management, server-side rendering, native applications. There's, again, that thing of don't be fooled that it's just a simple framework. But one thing I do like about VueJS in this regards as well is AngularJS is kind of, you will get all of these things whether you want them or not. I think they've got tree shaking coming in that can kind of drop out things later on. I don't know if they've got that yet. I think in use ones. Yeah, I've heard something about that. I don't know whether they do or not. React, on the other hand, takes the approach of we're just the Vue engine. You sort out the rest, it's up to you. But Vue take a really nice middle ground, which is, yes, we are the Vue engine, but these are our recommended approaches for these extra bits, and we will commit to contributing and maintaining those as well. So it's that nice middle ground. You don't have to use them, but if you do need to use them, you can be confident that you're choosing the recommended approach and that it will be maintained and looked after. So that was just a really nice, knowing that I can go into those and they will be around for a little while at least, and it's the recommended approach. So if you do want to know a little bit more about VueJS, as I say, the documentation was really good, and it is. I've learned everything that I know so far just from the docs, so they really are that good. I don't know if that, we will kind of live happily ever after. I'm sure other kind of frameworks will come along, but I do hope it's kind of inspired you to at least take a look and see if it's something you guys would be interested in as well. Before I finish up, I've got two last little things. So one of those is Shameless Plug. I don't know if you know, but I run a little event with Lee, which is called Code Cabin, where it's an unconference. We're the only people doing an Umbraco unconference. And what that means is we take 20 developers, drop them in the Lake District in the UK, kind of away from all the distractions, and just spend a weekend learning and sharing from each other. And it's just a really unique way of kind of learning different things. And because you're the people that set the schedule, if you don't learn something from that, then quite frankly, there's something wrong with you. But if you do want to come along, head on over to Code Cabin. Our next one is 12th to the 18th of October. It's an application process because there's limited places, and we just try and kind of create a really skilled bunch of people to come along. But do head on over there and fill in an application if you would like to come. And then lastly, Code Cabin itself is not for profit. We don't make anything from it at the moment. But if you know anything about me, then you may know that I also do things, package development with another guy called Lee Kelleher. We do things like the nested content, fluidity, stacked content. Vorto is probably another big one. But we do all of those out of the goodness of our heart, ultimately. We don't make anything from those. But what we would say is if you work for a company that does make or does take value from those, we would really appreciate if you could help us financially to kind of support those, because it's okay if you've got 1 or 2 packages, but we've got over 20 packages between us that we kind of look after. So it does get a big task. So if you would, like I say, if you do get some value, please do consider backing us and helping to support us. But with that, I am done. So.